Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. For thousands of years, death couldn't be reversed. More recently, medicine has developed techniques for shocking people back to life. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
For millennia, when people stopped breathing, they stopped living. The classic test for determining whether people were asleep or dead was whether they could fog a mirror held to their mouth.
Centuries ago, people in Amsterdam and London tried to figure out how to resuscitate drowning victims. In recent years, researchers have been able to apply the scientific method to revive those who have seemingly perished by drowning or heart attacks.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, we talk with Dr. David Casseret, author of Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, following a Mediterranean-style diet works as well as statin medication to prevent death from heart attacks. The data supporting this contention is based on a study of almost 1,200 Italians that was reported at the European Society of Cardiology. These patients had a history of heart disease when they enrolled in the study, and they answered an extensive questionnaire about their food habits. Similarity to an ideal Mediterranean diet was calculated on a 9-point scale. During the 7 years of follow-up, people whose diets most closely resembled the Mediterranean ideal were 37% less likely to die than those whose diets were least similar to a classic Mediterranean-style eating pattern. The most protective elements in the diet were vegetables, fish, fruit, nuts, and olive oil. The researchers point out that an observational study such as this is not capable of establishing causation. Still, a diet rich in vegetables and fish sounds tasty as well as healthy. For comparison, in previous studies, people taking statins were about 24% less likely to die than those not on statins.
A Mediterranean diet may also be good for people with type 2 diabetes. The PREDIMED study was carried out in Spain between 2003 and 2009. Over the 6-year follow-up, 3,600 subjects had type 2 diabetes. Those that got the most omega-3 fatty acids from fish were half as likely to develop diabetic retinopathy, a condition that can lead to blindness. Whether fish oil supplements would be as helpful is not clear.
Many people who need antipsychotic medications such as aripiprazole, olanzapine, or risperidone gain weight as a side effect of the drugs. For some individuals, this weight gain can be dramatic and dangerous. A new study suggests that the diabetes drug metformin can counteract this propensity in children and adolescents being treated for autism or developmental disorders. The randomized controlled trial included 60 participants. Over the course of 4 months, metformin reduced body mass index significantly more than placebo.
People with sleep apnea frequently stop breathing for several seconds at a time while they're asleep. This condition is often treated with a continuous positive airway pressure device called a CPAP that forces air into the airways. Because untreated sleep apnea is associated with a greater risk of hypertension, heart disease, and stroke, doctors have assumed that use of a CPAP would help people live longer, healthier lives. But the sleep apnea cardiovascular endpoints trial has just shown that although people are breathing better at night, they're no less prone to heart attacks or strokes. The study included 2,717 volunteers with cardiovascular disease and lasted almost 4 years. By that time, 15% of the usual care group that served as a control had suffered a heart attack or stroke. In the CPAP-using group, 17% had experienced such cardiovascular events. This difference is not significant. The authors conclude that CPAP improves mood and quality of life and reduces daytime sleepiness and snoring. It does not, however, appear to lower the likelihood of a serious cardiovascular event.
Research has suggested that people who eat nuts may be at lower risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, including heart attacks. Harvard scientists have recently reported on a study of over 5,000 health professionals who filled out detailed dietary questionnaires. They also provided blood samples for analysis. The researchers found that people who ate more nuts had lower levels of inflammatory markers in their blood. Substituting 3 servings of nuts per week for 3 servings of processed or red meat or refined grains significantly lowered C-reactive protein and interleukin-6. These are important markers of inflammation and have been associated with heart disease. Those who ate 5 servings or more weekly had CRP levels 20% lower than those who avoided nuts. Some people fear that eating nuts will make them fat because of the extra calories. However, most studies have shown that eating nuts is actually associated with a lower body mass index and obesity. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The line between life and death may be blurrier than you think. What have we learned over the last few centuries about resuscitating those who have had a brush with death?
To find out more about the history and science of reviving those who have just died, we turn to Dr. David Casseret. He's Chief of Palliative Care at Duke University School of Medicine. He's author of Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. David Casseret.
Great. It's great to be back with you.
And it's a pleasure to have you right here in the studio.
Dr. Casseret, our experience with TV death, which I kind of remember as a kid, it was so vivid. It captured your imagination. There'd be somebody in the hospital. They'd flatline, and people would come rushing in code blue and paddles, shock, and bazoom, the person was back with us. Or if somebody drowned, there'd be a little thump on the chest or a little mouth-to-mouth, and the person would spit up some water and boom, back. Tell us a little bit about, reality and your experience as a kid growing up thinking about death.
Well, certainly growing up, long before I went to medical school, my exposure to the science and success of CPR was much like what you described. It was something that was dramatic and vivid and, most importantly, virtually always successful. I mean, if you're going to have a cardiac arrest, the best place to do it is on a television program.
Absolutely.
Because there's an excellent chance you're not only going to survive, but you're going to survive waking up immediately, going back to doing whatever you're really doing.
Smiling.
And not only that, you'll be very good looking.
Always, especially if George Clooney is the one on ER who's the one who brings you back to life. In reality, things don't usually work out that way. CPR is a whole lot more messy, not nearly as successful. And the hidden truth is that often when people come back after CPR, even when it's successful, they come back with significant neurologic damage or physical limitations or both, not looking like George Clooney or anybody else. And that's a real challenge, especially since what we're exposed to on television gives a lot of us this idea that CPR is clean and effective.
And magical.
Exactly.
Now, early in your book, Shocked, you tell the story of Michelle Funk. When you recount this story, many people will recognize the general outlines, although I'm sure the name means nothing to most of us. How did she catch your attention? And tell us a little bit more about this remarkable story.
Sure. So Michelle Funk was about 2 years old when she fell into a creek and drowned, a creek outside of Salt Lake City in Utah. And she was underwater for about an hour, a little bit more than an hour. When paramedics arrived, they found that she had no signs of life, was not breathing, didn't have a pulse. But because she was young, they decided to try to resuscitate her. And they tried, as they were taking her to a large academic hospital nearby, and at the hospital they tried to resuscitate her for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So for a total of about 3 hours, she was without a pulse, no signs of life, until they finally got a pulse back, finally got her started breathing again, was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, went home, survived, did well, just got married about 2-3 years ago. And so that story, and there are other stories like it, of people who not only survive against all the odds, but do really, really well, make us think about what might be possible with CPR and resuscitation someday. If she could survive without a pulse, no signs of life for 3 hours, is it possible that 6 hours might be possible someday? 8 hours, 12 hours, a day, 2 days? Who knows what we might be able to do? That's not common. In fact, her scenario, her case is very, very rare. But if it happened with her, and it happened really successfully with her, who knows?
Now, she was one of the first cases. I mean, we have now heard of probably dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of people who have fallen into water, oftentimes very cold, oftentimes young people, so kids her age or teenagers, who somehow survive this experience, as you say, for a couple of hours with no heart rate, no respiration, no obvious brain activity, and they're brought back. So it's almost not that surprising anymore. But she was one of the first, and she really did catch the imagination of medicine. I mean, she was written up in the medical journal, right?
Right. The case report was written up in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it's hard to get much more attention than that.
I think they even used the word miraculous, which is pretty unusual in a medical journal.
The Journal of the American Medical Association in particular tends to be very staid, very conservative. For adjectives like that to pop up in a high top-tier medical journal is pretty amazing.
Now, why did that case make such a deep impression on you personally?
I think I heard about this case as I was on my way literally from college outside of Philadelphia to medical school, driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, found a newspaper with that story and heard about it. And that really opened up my head to thinking about the science of CPR and resuscitation and what might be possible, not just in resuscitation, but what might be possible in preserving life, bringing people back to life. And so for the first 6 months or so of medical school, I was really all set to become an emergency room physician. I wanted to become a CPR researcher. That changed over time. Eventually, I became a hospice and palliative care physician, the opposite end of the spectrum. But for a while, it really made me realize that the possibilities are both amazing and potentially endless.
We were fascinated to read the history that you recount in Shocked. Particularly, we were absolutely amazed at the idea that when was it? 16-something? Was it the 17th century or the 18th century that the Dutch put together a society for drowned persons to resuscitate people who had fallen in a canal and drowned in Amsterdam?
Tell us a little bit about that, how the Dutch got so interested in resuscitation.
Well, the history of resuscitation starts at a couple of different places, depending on when you start the clock ticking. But arguably, that society in favor of drowned persons, which was established in Amsterdam in the 18th century, really was the beginning. That was a group of concerned citizens who noticed that many of their fellow citizens had a really troubling predilection for falling into canals, of which there are many in Amsterdam, and drowning. And so they decided to do something about it. And so they banded together to create this group that was dedicated to pulling people out of canals, trying to resuscitate them in lots of different, often very creative ways. But most importantly, and this is why the Amsterdam Society is arguably the foundation of modern CPR science, they also kept pretty rigorous records of what techniques they tried to resuscitate people, whether they worked and whether they didn't. So that gave us an initial, almost crowdsourced science for CPR 200 years ago.
Well, 18th century Amsterdam, these people are merchants. They are accustomed to keeping very good accounts so that they can make sure that, everything is on the up and up. So I assume they applied that predilection and talent to keeping records of what they were doing. What did they do to try to resuscitate people?
And tell us a little bit about the case of Anne Wertman.
So, as you say, they kept very rigorous records, and these records are all available publicly, both in hard copy and online. And so you can read through various stories, some with names, some without. Anne Wertman is one of hundreds of stories. A woman who I tell the story of in the book, who fell into a canal and drowned, who had various things tried on her to try to resuscitate her, bring her back to life.
Such as
one of my own personal favorites was rolling people over a barrel. You'd take the lifeless person, put them over a barrel, roll the barrel back and forth in an attempt, in theory, I guess, to replicate some of the normal work of breathing or a heart beating, which didn't seem to work, was eventually rejected, but was very popular for a period of time. A related technique, which was not tried on Miss Wertman, was throwing somebody over the back of a trotting horse. Again, for some of the same reasons. I actually tried that in researching the book to see what it would feel like, and I have to tell you, it's exactly as unpleasant as it sounds.
Of course, if you were dead, you wouldn't mind quite as much.
And if it brought you back to life, then you probably wouldn't care so much about the how.
But it didn't bring people back to life.
Apparently not.
What about smoke?
Another technique that was used commonly, probably more commonly than a lot of people would like, is blowing tobacco smoke either into the mouth, into the nose, or into the rectum. That was popular for a period of time, thinking, I guess, that some of the pharmacology of the nicotine in tobacco smoke might have some salutary effects on increasing heart rates. And for drowning victims, it actually might have, in theory.
And ultimately, what worked for Anne Wertman?
Well, it's kind of hard to tell what actually worked, since many things were tried, including rubbing her with a distilled form of gin, putting her feet in hot water, and of course the smoke. All of those things together might have worked, or since there's still a lot of data we don't have about these stories, maybe she was just taking a nap and would have woken up anyway.
You're listening to Dr. David Casseret. He's a palliative care physician and health services researcher whose focus is on improving care for people with serious, life-threatening illnesses. He recently relocated from the University of Pennsylvania to Duke University School of Medicine, where he's chief of palliative care. His book is Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead. His most recent book is Stoned: A Doctor's Case for Medical Marijuana.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll find out what was happening in London when people in Amsterdam were rescuing drowning victims.
Is there any similarity between cold water shock and hibernation?
Resuscitation isn't necessarily the right thing to do in every circumstance. How can families make the right decision for them?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 1048. The number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about resuscitation today. For most of human history, when a person drowned, that was it. Same thing for a heart attack. But revolutionary medical advances have changed all that. How do doctors revive people who stop breathing?
Our guest is Dr. David Casseret. He's a palliative care physician and health services researcher whose focus is on improving care for people with serious life-threatening illnesses. He recently relocated from the University of Pennsylvania to Duke University School of Medicine, where he is Chief of Palliative Care. His book is Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead.
Dr. Casseret, you were talking about Anne Wortman and the attempts to resuscitate her back in, 1769 in Amsterdam. And I was sort of fascinated to see that they tried something that is somewhat similar to what we call mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and also the feather?
It's interesting you should ask about both of those two together, because if you look at the things that were tried back then, really is a really interesting grab bag of things that actually are predecessors to what we use now, and other things that are just ludicrous and crazy. So in the former category, yes, back in the 18th century in Amsterdam, people were beginning to experiment with a primitive form of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, either with bellows or with a mouth, which isn't that much different than what we do now, 200 years later. On the other hand, you mentioned the feather. There were some things that fortunately have fallen out of favor. One of those is tickling the back of the victim's throat with a feather, which at best won't do anything at all. At worst will cause the person to wake up and vomit, with then the risk that they'll inhale whatever their stomach contents were, which if they just came from a canal are probably pretty gross. So it's really the last thing you would want to do to a drowning victim. But these sorts of things, some which make a lot of sense, some which make no sense whatsoever, were tried. And for the most part, the things that didn't work tended to fall out of favor.
You describe that in London, then some decades later, that there was, again, a focus of interest, some experimentation on being able to resuscitate people who had perhaps drowned or perhaps appeared to have become dead by some other means. So what was going on in London?
In a sense, what happened in London was a continuation of what was going on in Amsterdam. Two people, William Haas and Thomas Cogan, as you say, within a decade or so, formed a society which later became the Royal Humane Society of the United Kingdom, with goals that were much the same as the goals in Amsterdam, to figure out how to resuscitate people in ways that were effective and to keep records. They did a couple of other things that weren't common in Amsterdam. One, they gave prizes, cash prizes for successful resuscitations.
Wow.
Or successful descriptions. And they also did something which, in retrospect, maybe was not such a good idea, but they paid for bodies. So if you found a drowning victim, you could take it to one of these Royal Society members with the hope of resuscitating that person and get some cash, which is not insignificant, for turning in that body.
Hopefully nobody got drowned as a result, because
and hopefully most of those were recent drownings, right?
Yes.
Now, we've been talking a bit about, children, for example, in the case of Michelle Funk, sort of going into water, being submerged, especially cold water, for many hours, being resuscitated successfully. And we've heard that maybe the physiological process that happens when someone, is suddenly submerged in water is a little like hibernation, which leads us to the lemurs at Duke University. Tell us a little bit about this connection between hibernation, lemurs, and resuscitation.
Sure. So to get back to the story of Michelle Funk, she had a couple of things going for her, a couple of positive points in her favor. One is that she was young. her brain was still developing. Neural connections were still plastic, and so were able to withstand an insult better than you or I would. Number 2, she was otherwise healthy. But number 3, she fell into water, as you say, and that water was really, really cold. And people have been interested for a long time in the power of cold to reduce our metabolism. And I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the equation is really, in theory, pretty simple. If your brain needs a certain amount of oxygen to survive, given its normal metabolism, if you can slow that metabolism down so it only needs half of the oxygen that it normally would, or 10% or 5% or 1%, in theory, you could stretch out that window of time that the brain can survive, and other organs too, but the brain and other organs can survive without being damaged. And cold seems to be very effective at slowing metabolism down. It's a way of hacking into our physiology in a way, inducing an artificial and pretty crude and temporary form of hibernation. But there's been a lot of interest for a long time in cold that's been increased whenever there's stories like Michelle Funk, who fall into cold water and do very, very well. You asked about hibernation. There are a group of researchers, of whom Peter Klopfer and the Duke Lemur Center here in North Carolina are very interested in figuring out how lemurs hibernate. And the rationale there is that lemurs, as far as we know, are the only primates that hibernate. There are plenty of other mammals that hibernate, but lemurs are the only primates that we know of. And so what those researchers think is if we can figure out what causes a lemur, our closest genetic relative that we know of that hibernates, to go into that state of hibernation, maybe we can figure out how to hack our own genes so that when a soldier is injured on the battlefield 12 hours away from life support, or somebody has a cardiac arrest 2 hours away from an emergency department, that we could use some of those tricks to induce a state of metabolism that's 1% of normal to open that window of time so people will survive and their brains will survive longer until help can arrive.
Now, even though we started by talking about cold and hibernation, and most of the other mammals we know about do hibernate when it's cold in the winter, it doesn't actually get cold in Madagascar, so the lemurs are hibernating, I think, during the dry season or something of that sort. It's not necessarily a cold-induced hibernation.
I wish I were an expert on lemurs and lemur hibernation. I was privileged to have a chance to talk with several researchers, including Peter Klopfer, who was kind enough to spend some time showing me around the lemur sanctuary. So I don't know details. You can think, though, of a variety of stresses that human beings or primates or others are put under. The sudden decrease in cardiac function is one, loss of a heartbeat is another, extreme drought, extreme cold. You can think of a variety of stressors for which the response of a dramatic drop in metabolism would be adaptive.
So we've been talking about the benefits of CPR and resuscitation and what a wonderful thing it is, and how someone who is seemingly dead, like Michelle Funk, can come back to the living and resume her life. And as you said, just a couple of years ago, got married. And it's a wonderful story. And ditto for using those defibrillators that are now all over the place at sports arenas and in airports. So if somebody's having a cardiac arrest, a bystander can get their heart functioning. And it seems fantastic. And yet, you've seen situations, I'm sure, where someone is resuscitated in the ICU, code blue, the team arrives, and there they are in the ICU for weeks, sometimes months, and then eventually die in a vegetative state. So there seems like there's a gray zone when resuscitation is something that's wonderful and sometimes maybe not such a good idea.
I think that's a fair summary. And it's important to emphasize that sometimes it really is wonderful. I mean, there are people out there who are walking around, spending time with their grandkids, half-grandkids, because of what we can do with resuscitation. But there are other people who are not that fortunate. I said early on that Michelle Funk's story wanted me to become an emergency room physician, but I strayed a bit and became a palliative care doctor instead. And that straying was really due in large part to some of those gray area stories that I encountered as a medical student, later as a physician. One in particular was a man who I met when I was in medical school who had a cardiac arrest right in front of me, went to the operating room to fix a blocked coronary artery, wound up staying 18 days in an ICU, never waking up, never saying anything more, never recognizing his family, and eventually died in the ICU. And many other people in between who are resuscitated but have significant neurologic or functional damage, can no longer take care of themselves. So there are these stories out there which are sometimes less obvious. They're not stories we talk about so much. They're not as visible, but they are as important. And so a lot of what I do as a palliative care physician is help patients, families, physicians to try to make the right decision. And sometimes the right decision is do everything. That's certainly the right decision for many people, but sometimes it's not. And helping people to figure out, given their preferences, given their goals, given their medical situation, what really, really makes sense for them.
That sounds like it can be pretty tricky.
It can be tricky, especially since there's a lot that we don't know.
Well, you say in your book that, you've learned as a hospice doctor, it's that we're all going to die. And yet there's that wonderful William Saroyan quote, "Everybody has got to die, but I've always believed an exception would be made in my case." And so I think a lot of people have a hard time coming to grips with that concept. And especially towards the end, they want everything done. And so when asked, do you want this DNR, do not resuscitate, on your chart? A lot of people say, no, keep me going. How do we help people with this really difficult decision process?
It's a really tough question to answer in 50 words or less. Maybe the simplest answer is to say that it's actually much more complicated than that. Certainly there are some people who have advanced illnesses, who near the end of life, who continue to want everything done. And we certainly work with those people to make sure that the decisions they're making are authentic, are well-informed, and well thought out. I think a lot of what I do as a palliative care physician is not only to support their decisions, but to help find those situations in which it's not quite so straightforward. To find those situations, for instance, in which a patient is saying, well, of course I want you to do everything because you haven't really told me of what the alternative is. In that case, talking about hospice, talking about palliative care, talking about what we can do to help keep people comfortable without that sort of aggressive treatment. Or helping to get patients, families, and physicians on the same page. So yes, sometimes it's as simple as somebody who wants everything done, but sometimes it's a matter of a patient who doesn't want to accept the DNR order because she doesn't want her physician to think that she's not trusting him. And the physician doesn't want to have that DNR discussion because the physician doesn't want the patient to think that he's giving up on her. And so nobody has that conversation. The same is true of family members as well. So that's something we spend a lot of time doing, not just helping patients to recognize their mortality, although that's part of it. Part of it is not really convincing anybody of anything. It's facilitating good communication that really should be happening all the time.
Well, it does sound as though a lot of us would prefer not to think that we're going to die today or tomorrow or even next week. And even if we become quite ill, we still prefer not to think about that. And we sometimes avoid those conversations. And it sounds as though you're saying that the physician may be avoiding those conversations as well, not the hospice physician, not the palliative care doctor, but the one who has been in charge of caring for the patient's condition. How can we change that?
Well, it's a tough question, and I think that the strategy for changing that is first of all to start by avoiding demonizing physicians. I think oncologists often get a bad rap for not being willing to talk about hospice care, end-of-life care. But some of my best friends are oncologists, and what they'll tell me is my patients come to me, particularly at high-powered academic medical centers, people come to oncologists and other physicians there because they want every option on the table. And so oncologists and other physicians walk into the room with those sorts of expectations. And it's also important not to discount the personal relationships. Many oncologists, cardiologists, geriatricians, internists take care of people not just for a couple of visits, but for years, sometimes decades, become friends, go to weddings. There's really a personal element. So that's all by way of saying it's not just a simple matter of using cues or triggers or browbeating physicians into having these discussions. I think to be successful, we really need to understand what those barriers are. And they're personal, they're professional. Some of them are skills. Some of it's just a matter of helping physicians to have the skills to communicate effectively. But I think any strategy needs to take all of those into account.
Dr. Kasserat, there are some people who are so afraid of death and the idea of death that they say, well, I want to live, if not forever, a long, 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 long time. Just freeze me. Just freeze me, and maybe in a couple of 100 years, bring me back. What about that?
These people call themselves cryonauts, which is maybe an unfortunate word choice. I actually had the chance to attend a convention of cryonauts a couple of years ago. These are people who believe, as you say, that there's at least a possibility that by freezing either bodies or brains or both, you might be opening the possibility to coming back, leading a normal, healthy life in 500 or 1,000 years once science has advanced to the point at which we can then be able to treat whatever caused your death in the first place. It's a bit of a long shot, but it's a long shot that increasing numbers of people are putting down $200,000 plus to gamble on.
You're listening to Dr. David Kasserat. He's a palliative care physician and health services researcher whose focus is on improving care for people with serious, life-threatening illnesses. He recently relocated from the University of Pennsylvania to Duke University School of Medicine, where he's chief of palliative care. His book is Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead. His most recent book is Stoned: A Doctor's Case for Medical Marijuana.
And Dr. Kasserat's point about having this conversation with our physician, with our family members, and really discussing, end-of-life decisions, it's really important.
It's terribly important, and far too few of us are doing it.
We need to take a short break. Then when we come back, we'll find out what cryonics might offer for the science of resuscitation.
Is there a way to freeze bodies without damaging their cells?
We'll get Dr. Kasserat's account of crowdsourcing resuscitation in middle school.
How long should CPR last? And what's the right rhythm?
And we'll learn about other technologies that may help people survive near-fatal incidents.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1048. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're exploring the line between life and death. How and when can people be brought back from the abyss?
Our guest is Dr. David Kasserat. He's chief of palliative care at the Duke University School of Medicine. His book is Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead.
Dr. Castro, you were just talking about cryonauts, people who believe that being frozen for a few centuries until medical science catches up with whatever it is they've got is a good idea. Does cryonics have anything to offer us for the science of resuscitation?
That's a great question. And I think right now the science of cryonics and the science of resuscitation are at opposite poles. Both in terms of the sorts of researchers who are interested in those areas, the sorts of people who sign up. There's not a whole lot of crosstalk between them. In general, though, the science behind cryonics, if you take out all of the science fiction-y aspects of it, the science of cryonics is that if you can preserve the architecture of cells and neurons in a way that doesn't actually freeze them, doesn't involve ice, doesn't damage them, it's at least theoretically plausible that it might work someday. And where it has begun to work, albeit in a very, very limited way so far, has not been in areas of resuscitation, but has been in areas of organ storage. So when some very small organs, heart valves, corneas, are harvested, they're frozen. And frozen successfully, and that dramatically increases their likelihood of being able to be implanted successfully. So cryonauts look at that and say, well, if you can freeze a heart valve, then ultimately you can freeze a person. They're actually quite different. It is. On the other hand, the science of cryonics is actually feeding both of those, the transplantation world and the cryonics world. Whether those will actually come together will mean that the science of cryonics would need to be taken much more seriously by the medical establishment, and will also mean that they probably need to stop calling themselves cryonauts, because that doesn't help matters.
You mentioned ice, and of course one of the big problems with freezing is that ice crystals form, and ice crystals are pretty damaging to cells and their structure. As you say, you have to somehow maintain the integrity of the structure of the cells. So I imagine that there are still some pretty big challenges ahead.
There certainly are, and that's where I think the challenges of freezing a person become an order of magnitude more difficult than the challenges of freezing, say, a cornea. When ice forms either inside or outside cells, just at a bare minimum, when water freezes, it expands. And so cells are mostly water, and so when a cell freezes and the water inside the cells freezes, the water expands, which just by itself, without even ice crystals forming, damages cells. Think about putting a can of beer in the freezer to cool it quickly.
Not
take a shower.
A good idea.
Right. You get a real mess really quickly.
But cooling can be helpful. And as you mentioned earlier in resuscitation, when someone falls into ice water, for example, in the middle of the winter, that there's a better chance, especially if they're younger, that they may be able to be resuscitated. We've also heard stories of cooling people during a stroke and how that may impact the surgical outcomes. And so I guess I'm wondering now a little bit about what are the optimal ways when someone is relatively young and relatively healthy to resuscitate them. So give us a little insight on CPR and what it means, and tell us a little bit about that middle school experience you write about in the book and this crowdsourcing survival process.
I had heard that the skills of CPR are being disseminated widely, not just to medical students, physicians, nurses, but to the general public. And I heard about a training program that was training middle school students outside of Philadelphia to do CPR. And I managed to finagle an invitation to participate in that class. And so along with a bunch of 8th graders, learned how to do CPR. And I think the lesson there is that some of the basic facets of CPR are really, really simple. One thing to know is that the mouth-to-mouth aspect of CPR has gone away for most non-trained bystanders because it's really, really difficult to do well. So it's not recommended as part of routine CPR anymore. It was also turning a lot of people off. Good research was beginning to show that people didn't want to do CPR because they didn't like that idea of mouth-to-mouth. And so people were literally dying because other people, bystanders, didn't want to use mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. So the cornerstone right now of recommended CPR is just chest compressions, which happen at a rate of about 100 beats per minute, which for those of you who were alive and well in the 70s happens to be exactly the rhythm of the Bee Gees song Staying Alive, which is unfortunate in a way because the only person at a typical resuscitation scene who remembers that song is probably the one who's undergoing resuscitation. Certainly the medical school students that I hung out with did not recognize that.
No, they wouldn't have heard
And
it.
that's really fast. It
is fast.
It's a upbeat tempo.
You can't tell by the way I use my walk. I'm a woman's man. No time to talk.
It is. And the two things that are most important is keeping that rhythm quick and keeping chest compressions deep. Matter of a couple of inches of chest compressions. And I got to tell you, it's really fatiguing. Having done CPR both in hospital settings as a physician and on mannequins in training and in medical school, you really need a couple of people who are able to do it because you get exhausted very, very quickly.
And this experience in the middle school, they did have a mannequin.
Right. Yes, that's a key part of training.
Yeah.
You don't want to resuscitate your fellow middle school students. You need a mannequin.
Definitely not. So give us some sense of the rhythm. I mean, how fast is the Bee Gees, and how would you go about doing 100 compressions in a minute?
Well, as I said, it helps if you have a couple of people, and it helps if you have somebody else who is keeping you on track. It certainly helps if you are very, very aware not just of the frequency of compressions, but how far you're pushing that chest in. There's also some good data that when you look back at various CPR attempts, those attempts where the chest compressions were both at the prescribed rhythm and deep enough as recommended, those are actually more effective. So keeping to that rhythm and making those compressions a couple of inches deep really does provide a meaningful increase in survival.
And how long should you keep doing it?
Well, in theory, you'd want to keep doing that until you can fix the underlying problem. So it's important to keep in mind that CPR is just a temporizing measure. Despite what you see on television, it's not like you do CPR for 10, 15 seconds and then the person wakes back up. It's a way of replacing, to some degree at least, the normal air movement and the normal circulatory flow, at least fractionally, to a tiny degree, for a short period of time until you can restart the heart, put a tube in to breathe through the person, and use more aggressive techniques.
So it sounds as though the first step might be call 911 and then start CPR.
Right. Actually, what the American Heart Association would say is the first step would be to check for responsiveness, to make sure the person isn't awake, also to check for surrounding danger, to make sure that you're not in a position where the resuscitating person, the rescuer, is likely to be in harm's way.
Stepping into an electrical current or something
Exactly.
of that sort.
What's actually happening during CPR? I mean, are you actually getting blood moving through the body and getting oxygen to the brain?
It's a fascinating question. And all the way through medical school, that's what I thought. All those patients where I was called to a code blue, and often as the junior medical student or intern, it was me who was assigned to do chest compressions. I always had this idea that I was pushing on the chest and that was pushing on the heart. The heart was beating artificially and that blood was flowing. Nobody's quite sure, but it turns out that's probably not the case. That you can't really compress the chest enough to mimic the heart's normal movements. And so what you're doing is you're squeezing the blood that's in the heart and thoracic cavity, and it's going forward into the arterial system. It's going backwards into the venous system, and it's just sort of sloshing around, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, if you think about putting food coloring in a bathtub and you swirl it around, eventually that food coloring would distribute throughout all of the water in the bathtub. And if you think about oxygen being in the lungs, if you can swish that blood back and forth, you're getting at least a little bit of that oxygen to the organs that need it. It's not quite as clean or as pretty as what I had always imagined during those episodes of CPR.
Imagination is a wonderful thing.
What about defibrillation? We now have all these devices that people can actually pull off the wall and zap somebody's heart. Do they really work? And what are the outcomes?
They do work. And honestly, in the last 20 years or so, the biggest advances in CPR have been, first of all, public health efforts to train everyone, including middle school students, to how to do CPR, number one. And number two, these automatic external defibrillators, which, as you say, are on the walls of bus stations, shopping malls. They're appearing on planes now increasingly. They're designed to be pretty much foolproof. You take them off the wall, you put the pads on a person's chest, and these defibrillators, in theory, are supposed to read the rhythm, identify whether there's a rhythm that's quote-unquote shockable, meaning a rhythm that would respond to a shock, or sometimes a pacing, and would administer those shocks as needed. It's tough to tell whether they work. My general sense, though, is that, yeah, they probably do. They probably really do. When I say it's difficult to tell, what I mean is that not every CPR instance and resuscitation is the same. But overall, if you look at a lot of studies, your chances of surviving if you just have a bystander who knows CPR is 9, 10%. Lower if you have other medical conditions, lower if you're in a nursing home, but overall about 10%. That goes up to about 25% or more if there's one of these defibrillators handy. And if the defibrillator finds a rhythm that's shockable, your survival rate goes up into the high 30s, close to 40%. That's pretty impressive. And that's really happened in the last 15, 20 years.
So that's a real technological advance. That's made a difference in the ability to resuscitate someone who's had a heart attack, for example. Is there other technology either already available or almost ready that will make a difference?
Sure, but just to back up for a second, it has made a difference, but it's important to keep in mind, we talked about these defibrillators being all over the place. And they are, but depending on where you are and what circles you're in. So if you're at a high-end shopping mall, if you're at a health club, sure, they're probably there. If you're in poor neighborhoods, gas stations, convenience stores, rural areas, probably not.
Not so much.
So they really do have the potential, as I said, to save a lot of lives, but they're not evenly distributed. So I think one thing, if we really do believe in them and we believe they work, there's certainly public health reasons to make sure that if they're present in a high-end mall, they're also present in the convenience store across town. You asked about other things that are on the horizon or being used now. One that's being used now is so-called hypothermia protocols in the setting of CPR. Right now, we do try to cool people who have a cardiac arrest, often using chilled saline by a couple of degrees, hopefully more, in hopes of buying them a little bit of time. There's a group at the University of Pittsburgh that wants to try to push that envelope even harder. Rather than cooling people from a temperature of 98.6 down to 95, they want to try to cool accident victims, for instance, down to temperatures in the 50s. And so those clinical trials are going on right now. That's probably the closest to real science that sounds like science fiction that could save lives in the next 5 years that I've heard about. And it's really exciting.
Dr. David Casseret, your book is titled Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead, which in itself is quite an interesting concept. What is it that you would like our listeners to take away from your book and the message today?
Writing that book was really a learning experience for me because I began to realize what is possible and began to learn a lot of things that we can do to keep people alive as healthcare providers, and began to see glimpses of what the future might look like just in the next couple of years. And it made me realize something which I know as a palliative care physician, but made me realize in very real terms, that this is something that we all need to think about and talk about with each other, with our family members, and it's something that we can all expect to have happen. This is a series of decisions that may come to us tomorrow if we're unlucky, may come to us in 30 or 40 years or more, but these decisions will arise, whether for ourselves or for a family member. And I would hope that over the next couple of years and maybe decades, as technology advances, that our willingness to have these discussions also advances. Because if what's possible increases exponentially, but our ability to communicate and think and make decisions doesn't, all of us will be left in this gap facing extraordinary technology, but not knowing what to do with it, how to make decisions, or how to talk about it.
Dr. David Casseret, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It was my pleasure. Great to be with you again.
You've been listening to Dr. David Casseret. He's a palliative care physician and health services researcher whose focus is on improving care for people with serious, life-threatening illnesses. He recently relocated from the University of Pennsylvania to Duke University School of Medicine, where he is chief of palliative care. His book is Shocked: Adventures in Bringing Back the Recently Dead. His first novel, Murder in the House of Rooster Happiness, will be out this month.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski and David Tripp are the engineers. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, it's not hard. You can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1048. That number again is 800-732-2334. You can also place the order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your thoughts on today's show. We'd love to get your perspective. Have you ever had a close call or a brush with death? We'd like to hear from you.
And if you've had one of those difficult conversations already, we'd like to hear how it went.
When you visit the website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You can listen at your own convenience, or you can share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
It's more challenging than ever to meet the demands of competing priorities that work throws our way. From emails to reports and project proposals, we need help to get it all done. Grammarly is the essential AI communication assistant that boosts your productivity at work so you can get more of what you need done faster, no matter what or where you're writing. Grammarly sets the standard for responsible AI and equips you with the best tools to do your job, like AI-powered features that help you write and edit quickly everywhere you write, or tone features that help you communicate more confidently. Just a few clicks can tailor your tone and writing so you come across exactly as you intend. No wonder 93% of professionals report that Grammarly helps them get more work done. Let Grammarly take the busy work off your plate so you can focus on high-impact work. Download Grammarly for free at Grammarly.com/podcast. That's Grammarly.com/podcast.